Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. I'm Dania Thafer, Executive Director of Gulf International Forum. Thanks for joining us for a conversation on socio-political and systemic dynamics of race and privilege in the GCC. Discourses of race and privilege have emerged recently in Gulf societies as the global community reacts to the brutal murder of George Floyd and the concurrent consequences of COVID-19. Both of these dynamics have shed light on institutionalized discrimination. With regards to the issue of race and privilege, the Gulf must not be taken as a monolith, as the dynamics in each country are unique to its own social, multiracial, political, economic circumstances and histories. Each GCC state has their own set of privileged and oppressed sectors, nested in various social cleavages. Discrimination is both socio-political and systemic, and progress will require a deep questioning of historical dynamics, social norms, political power, and economic policies. How can intersectional and anti-racist grievances be embodied in discussion on the Gulf in order to correct for discriminatory frameworks? In the face of the global pandemic, how will attitudes towards the disenfranchised continue to evolve? And how do we untangle these discourses of race and privilege in order to better understand and improve them? Of course, the topic of race and privilege in the GCC is multi-layered and multidimensional, and by no means can this discussion possibly be exhaustive or comprehensive. We are very pleased to have assembled an excellent panel today to highlight key aspects of these issues as they relate to the current events. As those of you who are familiar with the Gulf may know how challenging it can be to assemble a panel to address this particular subject. So we're grateful to have our panelists. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our panelists in the order of their presentations. Dr. Haneen Ghabra is an assistant professor at Kuwait University and an author of an award-winning book, Muslim Women and White Femininity, Reenactment and Resistance. She will discuss the intersectionality of privilege and oppression from both a macro and micro perspective in the Gulf. Dr. Clemens Chay is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute. His research focuses on the history and politics of the Gulf state. He recently contributed a new chapter titled Parliamentary Politics in Kuwait. In the newly published the Routledge Handbook of Persian Gulf Politics. I recommend anyone that follows the Gulf to read that book. And today he will discuss how different forms of social division, implicit or explicit, manifest themselves in urban politics of the Gulf. Abrar Alshammari is a Kuwaiti writer and researcher interested in socio-political issues relating to the Gulf region and the wider Arab world, particularly the intersection of cultural production and politics, as well as issues of identity, race, and discrimination within Gulf societies against marginalized communities. She has on-the-ground experience in advocating for social justice and will discuss how the ongoing pandemic has illuminated social disparities and inequalities within the Gulf. Just some housekeeping notes. Each speaker will have about 10 to 12 minutes. Then we will begin the Q&A discussion. After that, each panelist will offer 2-minute closing remarks. Please write your questions early on and before the Q&A session as you think of them, so we can have time to pose them to the panel. And with that, I will go ahead and pass the baton on to Dr. Haneen.
Thank you, Dr. Dania, or I guess you go with last names in the US. So I want to first discuss how power and privilege circulates, because I feel like a lot of people are not familiar with that. And what's really important is that it manifests differently in the US, in Kuwait, in different areas. Now, if we look at the US matrix of domination, or let's say privileges and oppressions, we have, let's say we have individuals with privileges, which are also ideologies that circulate. So let's say we have white, male, able-bodied, upper class, educated, heterosexual, etc. Those privileged positionalities are what are going to form the ideologies that circulate, which are then going to manifest into structural domains such as, like, let's say the media or the government, etc. laws, and then we're gonna tie it down with disciplinary mechanisms like the police, like the army, etc. And then at the micro level, it's going to manifest into microaggressions and like everyday insults. What I'm trying to say is that privilege and oppression are interlocked and they intersect throughout these domains of power. Now, if you look at the Kuwaiti matrix, so if we look at whiteness in the US, before I get to the Kuwaiti matrix, if you look at a lot of whiteness studies, the notion of whiteness is to be pure. So if I'm to be pure, which actually translates into asil in Kuwait, which actually also means pure, it translates into this Kuwaitiness, this purity. And we have that rhetoric of what is a pure Kuwaiti. And there's a lot of racism around that too. So what I want to do before I go into the Kuwaiti matrix is I want to say that what's happening with, we can't look at every system as a standalone system. Whiteness has affected the system in Kuwait. We've seen racist representations. We've seen derogatory slurs against marginalized identities, whether it's the domestic workers, whether it's the stateless individuals, whether it's migrant workers, whether it's even Black Kuwaitis. And so what we need to look at is how Hollywood and how the US, because it is a global system and it affects the media as a global system, has shaped logics of Kuwaitiness. And it's not only about bodies. It could be, so if we look at Kuwait, we have class privilege. So the main difference between the GCC and the Western countries is that because of the oil boom, our class privilege is so prevalent and it feeds our racial issues of that whole purity notion, again, that Kuwaitiness or whiteness, as we can say. And so to act upper class is to perform this act of whiteness and keep these communities marginalized. Now, if we look at the Kuwaiti matrix, there's this unique intersection of oppression. So we have, to be privileged here is to be Kuwaiti, is to have a Kuwaiti citizenship. So like in the US, it would be American, here it would be Kuwaiti. Kuwaitiness, able-bodied education, but also Sunni, right? So if you're Shia, you're more of a minority, but also Hadhari, which means modern, which is the opposite of, like, let's say, tribal communities, which are often also discriminated against. And I think it's important to know these intersections and also dialect, accent. You know, we're Arab. If you speak Kuwaiti with Palestinian accent or Kuwaiti with an Iranian accent, there's also different dynamics here and different levels of oppression. And so it's much more convoluted, as we can say. And so if I want to discuss a little bit about what's happening with the stateless individuals, and I want to discuss what's happening with the domestic workers, and then maybe also the expats. And so what I'm seeing here with the Bedouin, the stateless, is there's this we call them Bedouin in Arabic, and there's a whole history with the naming. We could go into that later if we have time. Maybe Abrar will, maybe if she has time. But the main difference between the GCC, I mean, with the Bedouin issues, is the intersection of oppression is unbelievable, harmful. There's an intersection of nationality. There's no they don't have a nationality. A lot of them, but not all, let's say 60%, but the numbers are not accurate, are Shia, so they're not Sunni, right? Most of them are tribal. There's a class privilege issue, because they live in poor conditions, and a lot of them, not all, most don't have an education. Now, they had a lot of these rights before the 80s. In 1986, there was a special committee that was formed, and they lost their right to education, health, and class. Now we have to understand that there's different intersections even within the Bedouin community. So if your mother is Kuwaiti, you can actually get education, even after the 80s until today. You could maybe go to Kuwait University, or a private university. But you have more privileges if you have a Kuwaiti mother, as opposed to someone that's a son or daughter of someone that serves in the army. You would also have a little bit more privileges, not as much as a Kuwaiti mother, but more than someone that's just plain out Bidun. And so what are these intersections of oppressions even within the Bidun community? And, you know, even with the numbers, supposedly they're 100 something thousand, but in reality, on the ground, people are saying, no, they're 200, they're 250,000. There's a lot of numbers that got kind of, you know, misconstrued, let's say. And I'll tell you a story that might speak to the numbers is, you know, in 1999, so there's a Bidun man that joins the army because his mother's Kuwaiti, so he can join the army. In 2005, they kick him out. They say, you don't have a nationality. This is the only solution for you to get a job. And so there's this, okay, I need a job. I need a lifeline. So what do I do? So, you know, between each other, they said, you know, you should get a nationality. They're not that expensive, couple thousand. You can get one of those third world country nationalities. He gets a nationality. Few years later, goes to renew it. Of course, they hire him back in the army, goes to renew it. It's expired. What does he do? He can't renew his passport. So he's like, okay, I'll go back to being a Bedouin and get an ID card. So they give them an ID card also. So you get an ID card basically. And you're at the mercy of hegemony basically, because if you protest, if you do something that pisses off anyone, your ID card won't get renewed. So he couldn't get the ID card because they said you have a nationality. And so what is this identity erasure dynamic happening here where you can't even be Bedouin, you can't even be from another nationality? And my point is that this case is not one. It's many where a lot become stuck and they actually go out of the statistics as well. And so how does that affect the statistics? And also how are we naming them? And it's very similar to how we're naming the Latinas and Latinos and Mexicans, and how we're calling them illegal in the US, calling them illegal residents, and it's the same naming here, and it's this politics of death. If you look at Mbembe's work on necropolitics, there's been a lot of suicides, and I think that speaks to how they're living. It's like the only way for me to be free is actually escape into death. And we have movements, we have, you know, like the Platform for the Defense of the Bedouin and other individuals working on it. I have solutions, but for the sake of time, I'm going to go in a little bit more into other communities. But there are other countries that are working on solutions, and I think that there are it's a unique intersection of oppression. Now, if we go to the expats, a thing I see commonly is we're always grouping the expats as if they're one group, but they're actually 100 different nationalities. So we're going to treat an American better than an Egyptian. And again, how does that speak to logics of whiteness? Maybe someone lighter skinned better than someone that is darker skinned. Maybe someone that is Filipino better than someone that is Indian. So there's also the structural and micro violence within the communities, within the expat community. And then of course, Kuwaitis to expats, which has been horribly heightened with the corona pandemic. Sometimes I can't even get on Twitter because it just feels like it's every single day. And so we're going to see a huge reduction in the number of expats that leave. Many have been laid off, jobless. Some of them have not received indemnities. Many feel insulted. And so we might see maybe a huge, not huge, maybe 20% like reduction in expats leaving just because of the corona pandemic. And so we see that unique intersection as well, but also the microaggressions are just unbelievable. And then if you look at the domestic workers, which is another unique group, and we have the kafala system, which is the sponsorship system. And so first, how did this system grow? It's because of the oil boom and neoliberalism and capitalism. And it became cheaper for the countries with oil, like the GCC, to hire other domestic workers. Now, the problem with the domestic worker issue is it's Kuwaiti women of color hiring other women of color. So it's like women of color oppressing women of color, except there's this class privilege here. So you have, let's say, upper or even middle or even lower middle class, because it's so cheap to hire a domestic worker. And this logic where they're coming and the numbers are just, I mean, Bahrain has like 90,000, Kuwait has 715,000, Saudi Arabia 2.9 million. The numbers are outrageous. And the thing is, in Kuwait, it exceeds 90%, and it's a double-edged sword. So if you look at like logics or theories of neoliberalism, if you allow them to come here, so if you abolish the whole system, it might hurt them because supposedly they're living in, their economies are so low that they need to come here to work, but it's as if we're feeding into this oppressive modern day slavery. And so what do we do? Do we abolish the system, or do we come up with stricter regulations? Because the regulations right now are unbelievable. Almost 12-hour working days with 1 day off, and nobody's following them. They're already horrible conditions, but nobody's following the law. So we can pass as many laws as we want, but we need to implement them. And so also, what is the gender dynamic? And Sheikh Bahaweed has an excellent article in Mashhur, but it's in Arabic, on this unique intersection of, if I am a male domestic worker, what privileges am I getting over a female domestic worker? So if you have like a male, usually they live in the house, usually male domestic worker, he's allowed to go have a vacation, but there's this fear by Kuwaiti women that the female domestic worker shouldn't really go out and take a day off. And I think this is modern day slavery, and we need to actually start implementing laws. But also, if you look at the stateless, and the expats and the domestic workers, the abuse, the sexual, physical, the rape that's happening. And we have this edited book that just came out, and Sada Nawari has this excellent article of the sexual abusive narratives that domestic workers go through. And it's about Lebanon, but it applies to the whole GCC. If you see these narratives, they're so powerful, but they're also it really shows you the gender dynamic within the system also. But also, how are we as a collective community trying to make change within? Now, if you look at the coronavirus, just to end things a little bit, we have a systemic ghettoization of all these nationalities, these certain nationalities, certain classes of workers, the stateless, et cetera. And it renders them very vulnerable in any crisis, which is why we saw everything in the crisis was so much more prevalent, and the racism was so much more prevalent, but also the numerous incidents of suicide. And I know Abrar is going to speak to the numbers, so I'll leave that to her, but the number of suicides that happened from migrant workers because of access to food, their areas were completely quarantined. We actually quarantined the areas that we ghettoized in the first place from modernization and neoliberalism and capitalism. But so what is this if you think about the structural and the disciplinary and the microaggressions, what is this silence that we have created? And so another thing I want to address is that they can't speak out. So if you speak out, you get deported, which happened a dozen times. If you say anything, your ID card doesn't get renewed. And so also, what is this rhetoric that we're using? And when we did ghettoize the areas, what is this rhetoric of filth and the rhetoric of infestation that we're using? Which is the same rhetoric that Trump uses against marginalized communities in the US. They're infested, these areas are dirty. And so how is this rhetoric of filth informing everything? And last, I want to know, rhetoric is also in our bodies, right? So what are the spatial dynamics when I was getting my PhD in the US, I'm very sensitive to these things. A white man would usually want me to move to the side while walking, right? And it's the same thing here. A Kuwaiti expects the Indian worker to move to the right. But now with the corona pandemic, it's like the spatial dynamics have reversed, and your Kuwaitis are starting to walk away from anyone that's non-Kuwaiti in fear that they're going to get the coronavirus, when in fact our numbers are becoming higher than the, let's say, expat and other communities' numbers. And so that's just to give you a general idea. I could go on, but for the sake of time, I'm going to stop because I think I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Dr. Haneen. So now we're going to proceed on to Dr. Chay's presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Right here I am, where I am, it's the evening, really late in the evening. I'm pleased to be here with the Gulf International Forum, and thank you for your invitation, Dr. Thafer. Pleased to be with a wonderful panel, Dr. Haneen and Abrar. So today I'm going to talk about urban politics and how these the phenomena played across space actually shows social divisions. So I'm going to start with macro point of view. So we start with a wider view of how cities are organized in the Gulf. And then we move in into the various social groups that are being segregated or perhaps included as part of urban planning. So I'll start with my slides, and I'm going to share them with you. So you have the first slide here. Let me see if I can pull it up on full screen. There you go. Right. So yeah, the first slide here, and we look at the mega projects all over the Gulf. We look at the tallest building in the world in the form of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. We see the largest real estate project in the Middle East in the form of the Pearl in Qatar. And we see another tall skyscraper in Bahrain in the form of the World Trade Center, which actually integrates wind turbines in the building. And then we see at the bottom of your screen here, the Jeddah Economic City, which is a planned project to erect the tallest building in the world that supersedes the Burj Khalifa. So we see this whole load of spectacular architecture, and you might be wondering, what does this tell us? What do these architectural symbols, signify or represent, to the person who's actually looking at them? And the first thing you realize that you're actually admiring them from afar. That's the first thing. And it's also sort of a geographical distancing, because in order to get there, sometimes and I would say you need motorized transport, which in the form of the car. And architects in the Gulf have realized that this is actually an implicit way of segregating those with the purchasing power or the financial power or the cultural capital to actually visit such places. So in that sense, it's a form of implicit segregation that we see that actually appeals to those with a certain status level or holding or possessing a certain financial capital. So if I move on to the next slide, we see more of these projects in the form of mega malls. And I have 3 photos on the screen. The first one, the Mall of the Emirates. Second, the Riyadh Gallery Mall, and the Grand Avenues of Kuwait, as we all know. And we see again spaces of contrived diversity in terms of, yes, you may agree that there's it brings in a certain crowd, a diverse crowd where everyone can shop or window shop. But at the same time, you realize that these spaces are consumer targeted, market oriented. And also at certain points when the mall is divided into specific sections, as is the example of the Grand Avenues, where they have a section called the Prestige and things like that, you realize that, these are catered specifically for a certain sector of the population with sufficient purchasing power or again, financial capital. So we start with this wider outlook of how urban planning is actually conceived in the Gulf. And recently I've attended a webinar on public space and how modes of public space are lacking for informal encounters, for exercise. And one of the Kuwaiti architects, Dr. Asil Al-Ragam, spoke about how there's a lack of sidewalks. It's not pedestrian friendly in the Gulf, and we are actually discouraging exercise and walks in the Gulf. And the whole point really is to have spaces of informal encounter where you see everyday people doing everyday things. So on this, I speak about how do different sectors of the population reclaim space. And one of the noted observations by another professor of architecture, Yasser Al-Shashtawi, has noted that in Abu Dhabi, for example, he photographed instances of how domestic workers, migrant workers actually negotiate space. So in this sense, you see people playing cricket and using car parks to play cricket, or using empty or leftover spaces to engage in sport or football games. And we see them in doing graffiti on buildings. We see them doing some planting in informal gardens, or the odd stall that you see on the corner selling orange juice. So we see how people are actually negotiating with space, despite the fact that there's a lot of state regulation on how space is conceived, how space is planned in the Gulf. So really, there are instances where people actually, go about engaging in unplanned urbanism. And in the words of Ashish Tao, he wrote an article about social disorder, but he views disorder in a positive light, in the sense that disorder equates to unplanned urbanism and equates to the social exploration of the other. So without these spaces of appearance, you can't see the other person, and you tend to conceive urban legends that tend to be negative about the other person or someone that you haven't seen. It could be the migrant worker, it could be someone from a tribal background, and certain things that you conceive without seeing them physically and appearing on spaces, on everyday spaces that you yourself work or play or exercise in. So I think this was covered by Dr. Haneen and will be covered by Abrar as well. But I'd like to speak a little bit about how space was organized to bring about or reinforce that Hadhar versus Badu debate in Kuwait, incidentally. So we look at the map of Kuwait, and you see it's organized according to concentric semicircles or ring roads from the first all the way down. And the first person, I wouldn't say the first, but one of the writers who actually wrote about how space is organized is Longva. And she in her discourse and article, the discourse on Hadhar and Badu in Kuwait, she noticed that, the outlying areas are reserved specifically for people of Bedouin origin. And it started with Bedouin, specifically called Bedouin housing in the 60s, or what we call Amasakin Badia. And then we went on to more popular housing, which was called Amasakin Shabiya. And we see a whole mushrooming of these areas from the 70s on to the 80s. So we see that these housing or area, again, reinforces or instills a sense of segregation because these segments of the population are placed at the peripheral areas of the city. And in order to get there and for them to get into the city, it's going to be quite a trek. So again, we see that whole logic, spatial logic of how they organize space. And the stateless, the Bidun, which a topic which Dr. Haneen mentioned as well. Again, the specific type of housing, ashish or shanty housing, really describing temporary structures that comprise wooden packing cases, old sheets, and really informal, rudimentary form of material used to house the stateless people. Again, you see a specific type of residential area, specific type of residential housing used to denote or connote that goes with the stateless people. So the link between the stateless people and citizenship laws and nationality was really expertly covered by Dr. Claire Bogron, who I'm sure is with us today among the audience. And she wrote her book Stateless in the Gulf, which she really, went through a thorough explanation of how these things went about. And in one of her previous articles before her book, she compared the stateless in the Gulf with the Shia population in Bahrain. And these are all tied to political rhetoric because, the Shia in Bahrain were sort of controlled in that sense by the government with a rhetoric of diversity. And on the other hand, in Kuwait, we see, a really different approach towards people of Bedouin origins and to the Bidun. So I would invite you to consult her book if you like further information. And then I move on to more social issues that touch on the lives of Gulf nationals. And I am sharing some anecdotes here. On the left is from an online article describing, a report that described how Emirati people felt about themselves, and how appearances, the complexion of skin, actually affects how they perceive themselves and how people perceive them. And what was interesting that I was speaking with a Kuwaiti friend, a lady, and she spoke of her growing up stages where she shared an old photo of herself with her first cousin. And she said that even though their mothers are sisters, but because she's of a darker color, and that's why she gets the question that, are you really that way? Are you really Kuwaiti? Are they really your cousins? And she feels that as though she's not good enough. So these instances of, subtle or not so subtle ways of perceiving or negative othering are actually present and there in society. And it's more complex than you think. It's more complex than just looking at migrant workers and the expat. Then it also exists. The point is, it also exists within the national population. And then this was sort of a pyramid or hierarchy that was conceived by Longva in one of her earlier publications called Walls Built on Sand. And she put sort of in a diagram the hierarchy of Gulf societies, where you have the Gulf male citizen at the top with the most sort of capital and power, and she lists the female Asian domestic workers. And I had a very interesting conversation with another Kuwaiti friend who said that during the times of the pandemic, we are actually seeing that the last two echelons at the bottom are maybe exchanging. In fact, migrant workers who are in the construction sectors are probably suffering more in the current pandemic times. So again, we see that there is many levels of social stratification that cuts across different layers of society. And this diagram is not exhaustive in the sense that there's also divisions within the Gulf national populations themselves. And to end off and to conclude my short speech, I end off with a food for thought, if you like. So, and I'm sure Abrar will continue with this. So in the Gulf, the family is a really important unit across the societies of the Gulf. So one thing is about the people speak about a lot, and to me is about the family, but also about marriage, and also about marrying someone of a similar status. So when this statement comes out, it implies really that there's different social status within the national population itself, and it goes along the lines of asl and muwahid. So we think about here the lineage, nobility, terms of nobility, purity, and people try to justify this because they are trying to avoid people who are trying to snatch their capital, whether financial or cultural capital. And you see the quote there from someone I interviewed, and you see that he recommends it because it ensures his bloodline survival. So again, something to ponder on, because is this really a legitimate tradition? Should it continue? Is it outmoded in today's world? Because if I were to recall and do some cross-referencing, I watch the Netflix series The Crown, and you see that there were also tensions within the royal family when one member of the royal family chooses to marry out of nobility or royalty, and it creates a huge hoo-ha. So with that, I leave a big question mark for our audience to ponder on, and I'll leave the baton back to Dr. Thafer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chay, for that very perceptive and fascinating presentation. Now we will go to our third panelist, Abrar.
Thank you, Dr. Dania, and thank you, Dr. Chay and Dr. Ghabra. I think you guys did a really good job of laying out the foundation that's very much needed for this discussion. What I'm going to be talking about is how this current pandemic, as well as the government measures that have been taken to counter the pandemic, have disproportionately affected various segments within Kuwait. I'll primarily be focusing on migrant workers as well as Kuwait's Bidun population. Next, I'll be moving on to how this isn't something that's coming out of nowhere. I'll be talking about the roots and the systems that have led to the current consequences that we are witnessing. It's important for us, I think, during these conversations to remember that this is the result of an accumulation of many years of ineffective policies and xenophobic rhetoric and inequality and so on. After that, I'll be moving on to the education system and how these different dynamics of race and privilege manifest within the education sector itself. And then I'll be talking a little bit about the current mental health crisis with rising rates of suicide among both migrant workers as well as people within the Bidun community. And lastly, I think we'll talk about the internal dynamics within citizens themselves. I think there's often this assumption that these dynamics of race and discrimination are perpetuated by citizens against non-citizens, but the reality is that it exists within these communities. As Dr. Chay had mentioned, we have the issue of Asl and Muakhid, which I'll talk about towards the end. So to start off with, in talking about how this current pandemic has affected migrant workers as well as members of the Bidun community, we see that there have been a number of migrant workers who have been laid off or who have been forced on unpaid leave and therefore have been left with no source of income and have struggled to be able to access their basic needs and food as well as milk and diapers for their babies. And in some of the government measures that have been taken, one of them is that they've decided to set entire areas that are expat majority under a full lockdown, meaning no entry or exit points. And this has made that situation much more difficult. Now, there have been volunteer groups who I have been working with that have been working on delivering these supplies to these groups, working on delivering the food that's necessary, working on delivering diapers and milk for families who have babies. But they're relying entirely on monetary donations in order to make these purchases, and the current situation is not sustainable. And I think this raises a question that I think is being asked across the globe right now, of whether to allow people to go back to work and be able to make their own source of income, but risk a spike in infections, or to contain the virus, but at the same time have them endure these economic consequences that, just keep getting worse and worse. And in looking at these issues, we also have to take into consideration that it's not just migrant workers that have been affected; it's also members of the Bidun population. And I think especially when we are talking about people who are stateless in Kuwait, there's also, I think, generally a perception that this community is a monolith as well, and we need to keep in mind that they're socioeconomically diverse as well. And some of them do live in similar conditions as what Dr. Chay had described, but others do have professional jobs. But I think the underlying root of why members of the Bidun community are struggling currently is the creation of the central apparatus 10 years ago, which has aggravated the systemic racism that Bidun people are exposed to, meaning that it gets in the way of them accessing education, healthcare, the right to travel, the right to get married, and even the right to employment. And during this crisis, it's become clear that there have also been a number of Bidun doctors and nurses who have been working without pay. They're frontliners, they're on the front line fighting against this virus, treating people who have been exposed to it, putting themselves at risk. But because of the current coercive nature of the central apparatus, they have not been getting paid. And we find that even when they are allowed to work, they're often exploited as cheap labor, and they're paid less than their Kuwaiti and their migrant colleagues. And I think this also brings us to an important point on representation and the ability to speak. There are a number of Bidun scholars and activists who do have research that can speak to their own lived experiences and who are conducting their own fieldwork. And I think it's very telling that it's difficult for them to be able to publicly speak about this. And it just shows, I think, that there's severe legal consequences for people who come from marginalized groups and choose to publicly speak out on them. And this, of course, makes, this creation of the narrative very difficult, in the sense that you more or less are hearing about these experiences rather than from the people who experience them. So that's on one hand. Moving on to the subject of education. On the subject of education, this is also something that's very long and has lasted for quite a while now. Kuwaitis, for example, have access to the public education system, but foreign workers and most of the Bidun population do not. There are some exceptions where, for example, if you're Bidun and your father served in the military in the past, then you can enroll in the public education system. So that means that the only option left is the private education system. And the private education system in and of itself is multi-layered, and the quality varies as well. And the other aspect, I think, that complicates access to education, particularly when it comes to the Bidun population, is the requirement to have a birth certificate, which was only introduced in recent years, a systemic element that bars Bidun children from being able to access education. And again, the central apparatus played a very large role in this. Moving on to the subject of mental health specifically, since the beginning of this lockdown, there have been at least 20 cases of suicide among migrant workers in the past 3 months alone. In the past 17 years, there have been 24 known cases of suicide from Kuwait's Bidun population, 6 of them being in the past year alone. So we see that, these systemic policies of discrimination and violence do take a toll on marginalized groups' mental health. With that said, we also see that access to mental health in and of itself is a service that has become a luxury rather than a right. So you have 2 options, right? You have the public sector, and then you have the private sector. The private sector is highly expensive and therefore inaccessible to a lot of these marginalized groups who are suffering with what is trauma as a result of all of these racist policies. And then you have the public sector, where if you turn to the public sector for your mental health care, it's often used against you later on. And perhaps Haneen would like to elaborate on this later, but I think we've noticed every time that news of a Bidun man committing suicide surfaces, we see that the media immediately is quick to say, but he had a file at the Kuwait Mental Health Hospital, making it out to seem like this person was mentally unstable, rather than acknowledging and condemning institutional violence and racism that led to these rising rates of suicide. Lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the internal dynamics of racism and discrimination among the citizen population itself. I think Dr. Chay touched on that a little bit. And I think it's important because, as I mentioned earlier, there are usually these assumptions that if you're a citizen, then there's no way that you could ever be on the receiving end of racism. But, this is a really diverse society, and people come from different backgrounds, different tribes, different origins, different countries. Especially, I think when we're talking about Kuwait, we are talking about a country of migrants. Everybody migrated from somewhere else to come and settle in Kuwait in the early 20th century. And I think in Haneen's description of basically what privilege looks like in Kuwait, she mentioned that you would be a citizen, that you would be Sunni, that you would be male. And I think just to build off on that, we should also point out that there's degrees of citizenship in Kuwait. There's first degree, there's third degree, there's seventh degree, and so on and so forth. And all of these do impact not only your legal rights, but also what, for example, marriage prospects you have, which Dr. Chay touched on a little bit. I think historically, when we're talking not just about Kuwait, but about crises in general across the world, scapegoating seems to be a common tactic. And in Kuwait's case, for example, Kuwaiti Bedouins have often been used as a scapegoat. So anti-Bedouin sentiment continues to be real, but currently, because they're preoccupied with, a new scapegoat, that being expats, so that has kind of diminished. And, you'll see it peaking a little bit more again around the time that elections come around. And it manifests also in the aspect of accents, which Dr. Haneen touched on a little bit, where, for example, if you speak Kuwaiti with a Bedouin accent, then you're perceived to be less Kuwaiti, or you're perceived to be foreign, or you're perceived to be of dual nationality. Within the tribes themselves, also, we have a hierarchy there, and this hierarchy plays into marriage prospects especially. It may not play into how they deal with one another, still being part of, by and large, the same demographic group, but it does affect marriage prospects. And I think, like Dr. Chay said, there's usually vested interests that this particular group is trying to preserve, and therefore that's why they reject any notion of the possibility of marrying from outside this criteria that the majority of Kuwaiti families have for who they can and cannot intermarry with. And I think especially in recent years, this is something that's happening a lot more, whereby you have groups of people who are romantically drawn to one another, but don't come from the same origin or lineage. In essence, they're defying the criteria that each of these families have. And, they end up being faced with the harsh reality that they are not actually able to get married. And I think that kind of emotional trauma is not something that should be undermined. It's a legitimate form of being exposed to and enduring racism and discrimination. And I think that brings us back to the point on what I think is a rising mental health crisis, where, yes, we are seeing that mental health is a crisis currently with migrant workers, with Bidun, but we're also seeing that it's a problem as well with a lot of Kuwaitis.